Welcome all, and thank you for joining McMaster alumni for this Archives Alive talk today. My name is Dr. Karen Balcom, and I am an Associate Professor of History and of Gender and Social Justice here at McMaster. We begin, as is our custom, and as we should always wish to do, with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners and ongoing occupants of the land on which McMaster University sits and the lands from which we join together today. As we gather virtually, I acknowledge that McMaster University stands on that part of Turtle Island protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, a sacred covenant binding peoples on this land to care for the land and care for each other in peace. The university is within the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations on land subject to Upper Canada Treaty No. 3, 1792, and adjacent to lands granted in perpetuity to the Six Nations of the Grand River under the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784. Each of us will join this gathering from another grounded location. In my case, I join you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, lands that are also subject to Upper Canada Treaty No. 3. I am deeply grateful for the care taken by the traditional owners of these lands, and by the vibrant Indigenous and Métis peoples who still live upon them. My family and I are settlers, and we benefit greatly from occupying these lands. It's my job to honor the land and to help repair relationships and treaties that have been broken. I do this in part by exploring this land acknowledgement with my family, with my students, and with you today, and by inviting all of you to use the chat to indicate the territories from which you are joining us today, realizing that you may be joining us from lands that are part of Turtle Island or from many other locations. If you are unsure about the names and traditions of the traditional owners of the land you occupy, I invite you, now or later, to use the tools at nativeland.ca to identify the traditional owners and begin to explore the treaties, covenants, and relationships that pertain to the land you occupy. Thus grounded, I am pleased to explain to you that McMaster University's Alumni Engagement Office partners with special collections and archives librarians to bring online events to our McMaster family every term. The library's Archives Alive series introduces us to the unique holdings of McMaster University's William Reddy Division of Archives and Research Collections. From rare books created before 1800 to contemporary writers' archives, this archive holds a wealth of resources. Please submit any questions you have during the webinar using the Q&A button on your screen. Special collections librarian Bridget Whitwell will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the presentation. And now it's my extremely great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Whitwell, who will speak to you today in a talk entitled, "And I Will Be Heard, Voices from the American Abolitionist Movement in the Liberator." Dr. Whitwell is a double graduate of McMaster University. She graduated with an honors degree in 2016, and then in December 2020, she successfully defended her PhD thesis in history. It was my great pleasure to work with Sarah as an undergraduate student and then to supervise her PhD work. Sarah's PhD research, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, explores how Black men and women experienced racialized violence during the transition from slavery to freedom in the decades immediately following emancipation in the United States. As part of this research, Sarah draws attention to the narratives and experiences of marginalized people that are sometimes difficult to access within the historical record. The external examiner on this thesis referred to her chapter on African-American women and sexual violence as the best thing he had ever read on this topic, that coming from an international expert on this topic. Another examiner called her PhD defense the best he had ever participated in 20 years at McMaster. And so you are in for a treat. Sarah is currently working as an educational developer with the MacPherson Institute for Leadership, Innovation, and Excellence in Teaching, also here at McMaster University. And so Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So as you mentioned today, I'm going to be giving a talk about the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper, and talking particularly about the career of its editor, William Lloyd Garrison. But first, I just want to take a moment and give my heartfelt thanks to the alumni, the Master alumni, and the library for putting this together. It's been a real treat to get to talk about my research to such a diverse audience, so I'm really excited about that. So just give me a moment here to share my screen. So on January 1st, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison published the first issue of The Liberator. A white abolitionist and founder of the influential American Anti-Slavery Society, Garrison called for the immediate emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. He used The Liberator as a platform to draw attention to the abolitionist movement, attacking slavery on the basis of morality rather than politics. At its peak, The Liberator had a modest circulation of approximately 3,000 subscribers, but its steadfast commitment to abolition and incendiary language captured the attention of several influential readers, including Frederick Douglass. Increasingly, both white and Black abolitionists used the newspaper as a kind of bulletin board to print and reprint letters, reports, sermons, and other content related to slavery and the abolitionist movement. Today, The Liberator endures as one of the most famous anti-slavery publications. It garnered support for immediate abolition and, perhaps more importantly, provided a platform for Black men and women to speak in their own defense. This talk is going to trace the history of The Liberator and the work of its editor, William Lloyd Garrison, within the abolitionist movement. I would like to note, however, that Garrison was a very productive man in his career, and The Liberator had nearly 2,000 issues during its publication run. So no single talk is going to be able to cover every facet of its reform work, but I'm happy to talk in more depth during the Q&A portion. So here you can see a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. And the first thing I want to start with is actually a little bit of an overview and context of slavery in the United States. So obviously, this was a long-standing institution, so I can't necessarily go through an in-depth discussion of all of the intricacies of this peculiar institution, but I'm hoping that this brief overview will sort of put us all on the same page. So when we're talking about slavery in the United States, we're aware of some of the changes that happened throughout its history. So the first Africans arrived in the continental colonies, what would become the United States, in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. And there is some uncertainty regarding the status of these Africans at the time of their arrival. But by 1660, slavery was an entrenched legal institution in both Maryland and Virginia. And increasingly, laws were put into place that deprived Black people, both free and enslaved, of many of the rights and privileges that were accorded to white people. So it's from this point on that we start to see slavery being tightly bound to race. And it's important that we remember that slavery didn't look the same across all of the colonies. Enslaved people engaged in a variety of tasks, and the conditions that they endured might depend on the geography and the nature of the local economy. So in the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia, for example, many enslaved people were put to work in non-agricultural production, like shipbuilding and ironworking. Others did grow tobacco. In South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, enslaved people were most likely to be working in rice and indigo production. And then finally, in the North, enslaved people were working largely on small farms or also in the homes of the urban elite. Throughout the early 18th century, thousands of enslaved people were brought over from Africa, as the enslaved population was not yet self-sustaining. But by the start of the American Revolution, we're starting to see some dramatic changes. One of these changes was a demographic shift. So enslaved people living in what I'll now refer to as the United States were capable of sustaining their population by natural reproduction. And increasingly, new technology like the cotton gin was making plantations into economic powerhouses. So this starts to cause planters across the South to expand their operations and also increase supervision over their enslaved laborers. So often when we think of slavery, it's this idea of the plantation South that's coming about from these changes that comes to mind. Between 1790 and 1860, approximately 835,000 enslaved people were moved from Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas further south to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. So this is, again, where we're starting to see that plantations really take hold. We're seeing a lot of enslaved people being further south. But more importantly, for the narrative we're talking about today, by the start of the American Revolution, there was also a shift in values and sensibility. While some groups, like the Quakers, had long opposed slavery on religious and moral grounds, the founding of a new nation prompted new conversations about slavery. Both religious and secular groups were now starting to argue that slavery was sinful and a violation of natural rights. This dual existence of slavery and freedom in the United States became a paradox. So anti-slavery sentiment transitioned towards a formal movement during and immediately following the American Revolution. But few were calling for an immediate end to slavery at this time. Instead, most favored gradual emancipation. Pennsylvania in 1780 passed a gradual emancipation law, as did Rhode Island and Connecticut in 1784. So even though these laws are technically abolishing slavery, they still very much favor slaveholders over the enslaved, as they're not freeing enslaved people outright. Instead, they're making provisions for the children of enslaved people to become free, but only after they have worked from childhood into adulthood. By 1804, every northern state had implemented some kind of legislation for gradual emancipation. However, census records indicate that enslaved people in the North were still enslaved as late as 1840. Alongside gradual emancipation, many Americans who considered themselves anti-slavery supported colonization. And this was a movement to transport free Black people to Africa. So the American Colonization Society, founded in 1816, assisted in the creation of the colonies in West Africa that would eventually form the Republic of Liberia. Although associated with anti-slavery, the colonization movement was born more from racism than a desire to secure the rights of Black people. Many white supporters of colonization did not want to compete with free Black people for jobs, nor did they want them attending schools alongside white children. The Haitian Revolution also increased support for colonization, as many white people became fearful about living alongside free Black men and women. There was a lot of fear around this time about the possibility of a deadly revolt. During the 1810s and 1820s, the colonization movement attracted a large number of highly respectable supporters, including political leaders like Henry Clay. Congress, in conjunction with the ACS, so that's the Colonization Society, even funded the cost of transporting free Black people to Liberia. But while there was a lot of support from white people, African Americans were largely against colonization, arguing that the United States was their home. At this point, the international slave trade had ended, and the enslaved population was being sustained through natural reproduction. The reality is that many enslaved people had been born in the United States and had never set foot in Africa before. Moreover, many who had come from Africa had come from different regions and didn't speak the same language. It didn't make sense to them that they should all be put together in this one colony. The reality is that there can be more variation within a race than between the races. Yet the colonization movement was grouping all people with dark skin together. To entice Black men and women to participate in the colonization movement, relocation to Liberia was sometimes tied to emancipation. So if enslaved people wanted to be manumitted, they had to essentially agree to immediately leave the United States. So some did make this option, deciding that relocation in exchange for freedom was a worthy trade, but many did not agree. By the early 1830s, it was clear that colonization was failing. Each year, the slave population was growing by approximately 50,000, but between 1822 and the Civil War, only 15,000 people total made the decision to relocate to leave the United States. As support for the colonization movement declined, abolitionists again began to call for an end to slavery wholesale within the United States. African Americans especially came to the forefront in these movements, and they started leading and staging protests. They spoke out against discrimination and racialized violence. In fact, it was Black abolitionists who were making some of the earliest calls for an immediate end to slavery, while white abolitionists were still more likely to support gradual emancipation. In 1827, Samuel Cornish founded Freedom's Journal, the first African American newspaper. And it became the voice of Black protest and it advocated strongly for Black rights. Cornish, along with his co-editor John Russwurm, argued that the press was the most economic way to achieve, quote, the moral, religious, civil, and literary improvement of our injured race, end quote. In the opening editorial written by Cornish, the editors proclaimed, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." Unfortunately, Freedom's journal struggled financially. It wasn't very long before the journal was primarily reprinting articles instead of having new content, and also appeals for payment of past dues began to dominate the pages. By 1829, the newspaper was no longer in print. But it did set the stage for other abolitionist newspapers, including the Liberator. And on January 1st, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a journalist and social reformer, published the first issue of the Liberator. This newspaper, unlike other newspapers being published by white abolitionists, had its roots in Black abolitionism. Garrison was inspired by their calls for an immediate end to slavery, and he began to take up and print the arguments that had been circulating among Black abolitionists for some time. In the inaugural issue, Garrison wrote, "Park Street Church, on the 4th of July, 1829, I unreflectedly assented to the popular but pernicious doctrine of gradual abolition. I seize this moment to make a full and unequivocal recantation, and thus publicly to ask pardon of my God, of my country, and of my brethren, the poor slaves, for having uttered a sentiment so full of timidity, injustice, and absurdity." A similar recantation from my pen was published in the Genius of Universal Emancipation in Baltimore in September 1829. My conscience is now satisfied. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of a ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead. With this address, Garrison started what historians refer to as the second wave of abolitionism. From this point on, we see more public and vocal calls for an immediate end to slavery without compensation for slaveholders. And it's at this point that we see these arguments being made in wider circles and not just via segregated channels. Immediate abolition was a seemingly radical idea. Many conservatives and moderates in the North opposed immediate abolition, still favoring gradual emancipation. If you remember, I stated earlier that there were still enslaved people recorded in the census for the North as late as 1840, nearly a decade after the first issue of the Liberator. But within 4 years of the Liberator's first publication, 200 abolitionist societies emerged in favor of immediate abolition. Garrison and the Liberator changed the trajectory of the abolitionist movement. In order to understand how the Liberator changed the landscape of the movement, we first need to understand a little bit more about its founder, who's pictured here, circa 1870. William Lloyd Garrison was descended from indentured servants, so he had great sympathy for the enslaved and the working poor. In his early years, he was abandoned by his father, and he suffered long separations from his mother, who worked as a nurse. In particular, she tended to women who had given birth, and she would actually live with them, leaving Garrison alone for long periods of time. He experienced extreme poverty and hunger, and at one point he ran away from his guardians. He was even put to hard labor as a child, before eventually he found work as a printer's apprentice. Working for the Newburyport Herald, Garrison learned how to set type. But he never really saw journalism as his calling. He saw it as a means to an end. After writing for a number of newspapers associated with various reform movements, he eventually came to edit the Journal of the Times, a newspaper from Vermont. Under Garrison, the newspaper began to publish a large number of anti-slavery pieces. Like Cornish and Russwurm, who were the founders of the first African-American newspaper, Garrison recognized that the press was a valuable tool that he could use to advance abolitionism, as well as other reform movements. Garrison first became involved in the anti-slavery movement around the age of 25 after reading Reverend John Rankin's Letters on Slavery. And he found that these ideas really stuck with him. And by 1829, Garrison was delivering incendiary speeches in favor of abolition, and he was working closely with a number of anti-slavery organizations to spread his message. Although at this time in his career, Garrison was associated with the American Colonization Society, as were many prominent abolitionists at the time. Still, Garrison's ideas about abolition were always evolving, and many of his later ideas about abolition would take root during this early period. For example, in 1829, he argued that slavery would bring the wrath of God down on the, quote, catastrophe of Republican America, end quote. And this kind of moralistic argument in which Garrison framed slavery as a sin became very characteristic of his anti-slavery work. And ultimately, it was this kind of incendiary language that was very polarizing. And it wasn't long after that speech that Garrison recanted his support for gradual emancipation, having forged close ties with many Black abolitionists. When he attended abolitionist rallies and anti-slavery protests, he couldn't help but notice the audible displeasure of Black audiences when speakers would talk about their support for colonization. So Garrison realized that this was something the Black community did not support, and that helped inform his decision to recant. He came to believe that immediate abolition was the only morally correct solution to the problem of slavery in the United States. He drafted the prospectus for the Liberator in August 1830, and he did manage to secure $100 in funding. He initially struggled to find a press. He was turned down in Washington, but he did eventually find a home for his newspaper in Boston. The decision to publish the first issue of the Liberator on January 1st was deliberate. For African Americans, the day had great significance. It marked the abolition of the African slave trade and also the founding of Haiti. And this careful attention to Black history was an early indicator that Garrison intended the Liberator to be a site of interracial collaboration. And indeed, Garrison spoke openly on many occasions that he did not believe the Liberator belonged to white people. He saw it as an organ of the Black community. And this is really also reflected in its readership. The Liberator was always most widely read among the African American community. In its first year of publication, it had approximately 500 subscribers, 400 of which were African Americans. So they were very much sustaining Garrison with financial, moral, and political support. Eventually, the subscription list of the newspaper expanded to over 2,000 individuals, but African Americans still constituted roughly 3/4 of the readership. And I should also note, however, that while the subscription circulation was modest, these newspapers would have been shared and passed around. So the readership was actually much higher, but this is just the paid subscriptions. Some African Americans eventually became agents for the newspaper, so they were the ones selling the subscriptions. Arthur Tappan, who was a white abolitionist and a very successful merchant, was an agent for the newspaper, but he actually asked Garrison not to publish his information and his involvement in the project because he was afraid that it would negatively impact his business interests. Black abolitionists, however, were enthusiastic agents. Cornish, who I previously mentioned, published the newspaper, became an agent, as did Black abolitionists across the North, from Baltimore to New York, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. The Liberator appealed to Black audiences because of its steadfast commitment to abolition and its unapologetic attacks on the evils of slavery. Moreover, Garrison was widely considered to be an ally, and he even hired Black apprentices to help with publication. For Garrison, the Liberator was intended to be an interracial site of collaboration. Unlike many other anti-slavery publications that were coming out at this time, the Liberator didn't make its appeals to end slavery on the basis of politics. Instead, the newspaper was very much making its arguments on moral suasion. So Garrison believed that direct appeals to conscience would ultimately convince slaveholders and their supporters that slavery was a moral evil. He really wanted white Americans to come to the realization that Black Americans were their fellow countrymen. And so the moral evils of slavery are always at the forefront of the newspaper. And we can actually see that in the masthead, which I have depicted on the slide here. So this was the masthead that appeared on most issues of the Liberator between 1831 and 1838. And what it's showing here, if you can't make it out clearly, is a slave auction. And what we see is a family being torn apart at the auction block. Moreover, on the far left, which is small and harder to make out, I recognize that, we see a Black man being whipped by a slaveholder within sight of the Capitol building. And there's actually a flag flying on that Capitol building, which ironically reads Liberty. So the Liberator was often drawing attention to the hypocrisy of slavery and a nation that upheld the belief that all men are created equal. Occasionally, white abolitionists asked Garrison to tone down his language. They were really afraid that his uncompromising nature would alienate more moderate supporters of abolition. But Garrison really believed that he needed to be as harsh as truth and uncompromising as justice in his rhetoric. Perhaps more radical, however, was Garrison's insistence on placing Black voices at the forefront of the Liberator. In Garrison's mind, he was an unflinching and untiring advocate. To his Black supporters, he explained, quote, "Your rights and the defense of your character will be the leading object of the paper," end quote. So he is keeping their narratives very much at the forefront. He is publishing letters. He is writing, publishing anti-colonization articles. They're all written by African Americans, along with their reports, their sermons. While he is writing his own content, he is definitely using this as a kind of bulletin board to showcase the voices of the people who have direct experience with slavery. William Wells Brown, a formerly enslaved man and prominent abolitionist, had many pieces published in the Liberator, including his own personal narrative of his time during slavery. Garrison also published letters between Brown and his former slaveholder. Another popular narrative that was covered was that of Ellen and William Craft, an enslaved couple that fled from Macon, Georgia. And what was really striking about this particular account of a runaway was that Ellen passed herself off as a white male planter, with William acting as her personal servant. So this daring escape really captured the public mind, which Garrison published widely. He was friends with the couple and did write to them. And he also wrote about the lectures that they were giving, and he liked to talk about failed attempts to recapture the couple after they had fled slavery. So Garrison was a staunch supporter of abolition and a champion of Black voices, to the point that some actually believed that the editor was a Black man. William Fowell Buxton, who was a member of Parliament, met Garrison in England, and he was allegedly astonished to find out that Garrison was a white man. Garrison, for his part, received the misconception as the best compliment. Garrison was largely uninvolved in politics during his career. He never joined any political parties, and he's actually well known for keeping himself at a distance. Horace Selden, who compiled the Liberator files, which is a great compilation of online material, claimed that if Garrison had participated in politics, it would have been akin to admitting that his moral suasion had failed. To be a party man, he argued, might taint a moral position, either with actual or perceived lust for political power. So even as other abolitionists were getting involved in political parties or creating their own, Garrison always remained outside of and critical of their efforts. But he was aware of politics. The Liberator regularly published news about politicians and their actions or lack thereof. He also promoted petitions for political action that would benefit the abolitionist movement, so petitions against fugitive slave laws. He also published a petition in favor of personal liberty laws, which would give accused runaways the right to a jury trial. And this petition actually gained approximately 65,000 signatures. So Garrison was trying to leverage his publication very much for the support of initiatives that would benefit enslaved people and hopefully bring about the end of slavery. Manisha Sinha, who's a historian of the abolitionist movement in the United States, argued that Garrison took abolition in new directions, both organizationally and ideologically. When Garrison first published The Liberator, the abolitionist movement was relatively unified. Debates continued about colonization and the issue of gradual versus immediate emancipation, but there weren't really separate factions. But Garrison's advanced positions on gender and racial equality ultimately caused something of a schism, and we start to see a more aggressive phase in anti-slavery reform as a result of his work. In supporting the equal participation of women in the abolitionist movement in particular, Garrison united a number of abolitionists around his leadership while alienating many others. Garrison ultimately was promoting a very broad platform that attacked the state, the military, the church, and essentially any institution that he believed supported slavery. And this, of course, was a very radical vision to many. So unsurprisingly, the Liberator and Garrison came to face a lot of opposition. Garrison favored nonviolent means. He did not promote riots, protests, or anything of the kind, though he did support resistance by enslaved people. But state legislators and local slaveholders in the South still bitterly opposed the editor. Henry Mayer, who wrote the definitive biography on Garrison, described the editor as the preeminent agitator of the century. North Carolina indicted Garrison for felonious acts. The Vigilance Association of Columbia, South Carolina, offered a $1,500 reward for anyone who could identify distributors of the newspaper. Eventually, the entire state of Georgia put a $5,000 bounty on Garrison's head, and he received a large number of death threats, some of which he chose to publish in his newspaper. Even in the North, newspapers, conservative and colonizationalists, tried to shut down the Liberator. Boston's mayor, Harrison Gray Otis, sent a sheriff to try and intimidate Garrison, and he dismissed the newspaper as one read mainly by Black people. So Garrison was regularly provoking outrage throughout the United States. In 1835, a Boston mob formed to protest the anniversary of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. Garrison was present as a speaker, and when an initial target, an abolitionist from England, couldn't be found, this mob redirected their anger towards Garrison, and they actually got as far as placing a noose around his neck. So Garrison made a narrow escape, and he was placed in jail for his own protection. So this lock to Garrison's jail is a bit deceiving. He was not jailed for his actions, but for his own protection, because the opposition was so great that authorities did think that his life was in danger. But despite this resistance, the Black community was continuing to provide support for the Liberator and its editor. Garrison continued to lecture to Black audiences. He corresponded regularly with Black abolitionists, and he often stayed in the homes of Black friends and colleagues when he was traveling. Garrison was very proud of his work, and in his mind, the support of the Black community vastly outweighed any abuses that he faced. Today, the Liberator is often remembered as being the most famous abolitionist newspaper of the 19th century. Not only did the newspaper popularize immediate abolition and change the trajectory of the abolition movement, but it provided that voice for the Black community to speak in their own defense, as well as it provided the impetus for more voices to enter the conversation. It's often very difficult to access the voices of Black people, especially those who were enslaved. The reality is that many Black men and women were illiterate during this time period. They didn't write letters, keep journals, or otherwise record their thoughts in a way that we can access today. The work of abolitionists then offer us a window through which we can begin to understand their experiences. By reporting news related to slavery, transcribing slave narratives, and promoting speaking engagements by Black community members, abolitionists helped bring to light narratives that might otherwise have been lost. Many of the slave narratives that we have today were in fact recorded by abolitionists who were using them to try and shed light on the horrors of slavery, which of course means we need to pay attention for exaggerations, retrospective musings, and other manipulations or distortions that were intended to rally support against slavery. Again, there was an agenda with these pieces being published. In the case of the Liberator, we need to pay particular attention to Garrison's racist paternalism. So although Garrison was undoubtedly an opponent of slavery and he supported Black rights, his focus on racial uplift implicitly suggested that Black men and women were somehow inferior. He believed that slavery had degraded Black people, crippling their intellect, debasing their moral nature. Even though he never blamed biology for these differences, Garrison did promote the idea that Black men and women needed to be uplifted before they could truly be considered equal. So this is always lurking in the background and something that we should be aware of today when we're going through these documents. But by drawing attention to these limitations, it's not my goal to discount the work of the Liberator or suggest that we can't use the newspaper to access Black voices. I'm just trying to remind everyone that we need to be critical when we read these sources, to think about why they were created and by who. In some ways, the limitations of the Liberator gave us new platforms for Black voices. So I imagine some of you are wondering about Frederick Douglass, who is one of the most famous Black abolitionists. His narratives are very well known. And the careers of these two men did intersect. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were friends. They met initially when Garrison was giving a speech and Douglass was asked to talk about his own experiences as an enslaved man. And the two men eventually began to collaborate, recognizing that they had some shared goals. In many ways, we can look at Garrison as an early mentor to Douglass, who was quite young at the time of their meeting. But the men did eventually have a falling out, sometime around 1840s, 1850s. There's no exact date tied to their falling out, but they began to disagree about the best ways to secure the end of slavery. In particular, Douglass objected to Garrison's argument that the Constitution was pro-slavery and that the only way to end slavery was for the North or the free states to secede from the Union, which Douglass did not agree with. Some saw this as abandoning those who were enslaved in the South. So this ultimately caused a schism combined with the racist paternalism that Garrison had long demonstrated. So this ended their relationship. And they never reconciled before Garrison died in 1879. But what did come of this argument and this relationship was Douglass's own abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. And when he described why he started the newspaper, Douglass said that he thought it was finally time for Black men and women to be in control completely of their own narratives. By 1861, the Liberator had subscribers across the North, as well as in England, Scotland, and Canada. Issues continued to filter down into the South, though again, Garrison was essentially a wanted man below the Mason-Dixon line. And publication of the Liberator continued until the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment. On 29 December 1865, Garrison published his final issue. At this point, the weekly newspaper had released 1,802 issues. In his final column, Garrison celebrated the 13th Amendment, and he also said his goodbyes. He wrote that the object for which the Liberator was commenced, the extermination of chattel slavery, had been achieved. He no longer felt that his vocation existed, and he decided to turn himself to new efforts, new reform movements. But he ended on a very optimistic note, stating that now he would have support from millions instead of just hundreds of Black people for allies. So he did continue to work towards Black rights, and he also spent a lot of his later career advocating for women's rights. So at this point, he withdrew entirely from the abolitionist movement, and he felt that he was finished. And for the remainder of his career, he continued to use the newspaper, but the Liberator he did formally end. And that is where I'll conclude and give the opportunity for questions.
So thank you so much, Dr. Whitwell, for your deeply informative presentation. I learned a lot about one of the resources that I'm fortunate to work near. And also thanks to Dr. Balcom for your wonderful introduction. So my name is Jillian. I am an archivist in the library's Division of Archives and Research Collections. And today I will be moderating the question period. So again, please put your questions in the chat if you have any. And we have received some wonderful questions in advance, so I think I will start there. So Sarah, the first question is about women's rights in the context of abolition. Did women contribute articles to the Liberator and or form a significant part of its readership?
Which is a great question and something I wish I'd had more time to devote to in this talk. One of the things that really set Garrison and the Liberator apart was the involvement of women within this section of the abolitionist movement. Many abolitionists did not believe that women should be involved in the movement, and there were often protests. Many anti-slavery societies explicitly excluded women, but Garrison was an advocate for women's rights, and this is really what set the Liberator apart from so many of its contemporaries. Of course, this also caused the schism that I mentioned during the talk, as many people did not want to support him because of his views on women's rights. In 1838, in the prospectus, Garrison actually made his support very explicit when he stated that the Liberator was intended to redeem woman as well as man from a servile to an equal condition. So he later actually founded the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society in an effort to give more voices to women within the abolitionist movement. And the Liberator continued to be a site of publication for works by female abolitionists, including the most famous of which would probably be the Grimke sisters. So in 1838, Garrison published Sarah Grimke's Letters on the Province of Woman, and he regularly promoted women's rights through editorials, petitions, conventions, calls for proceedings, things that weren't getting a lot of attention in other newspapers that had this kind of readership.
Thank you. That's great. We have another question here about illustrations. We received a lot of questions about illustrations apart from the masthead. So I wondered if the Liberator featured any.
The Liberator did not typically have much in the way of illustrations, but this wasn't anything unusual for the time period. Until the 1850s, newspapers generally didn't feature a lot of images. There might be small woodcuts, for example, to signify maybe a runaway enslaved person or to indicate that some property was for sale. But there weren't at this time period images that were directly relating to the news articles, at least not in the way that we associate them today. So as we can see with the Liberator, the masthead was usually the most elaborate, if not the only illustration. And this wasn't unique to the Liberator. This was very common among newspapers from the same time period. And the reason for this largely was cost and the technical challenges of producing these newspapers. Even once lithography was introduced, newspapers continued to avoid heavy use of images because it just couldn't be produced using the movable type. And one of the ways that Garrison ensured the viability of his newspapers was that he wrote everything directly when in the typeset. He was not writing and then transferring. So this limited his ability to include illustrations. It really isn't until the 1850s that we actually see newspapers that have illustrations in any sustained way.
I see. Thank you. A lot of questions as well about the Canadian connection. So are there Canadian connections to the Liberator? And also, did Garrison ever travel to Canada?
I'm not sure if Garrison ever traveled to Canada. He did travel extensively to England, where a lot of conventions were being held around anti-slavery. He even lived there for a year in an effort to hide from his enemies because there were threats out against his life. The most obvious connection to Canada would be the fact that Canada, often sort of referred to as the North Star, the name of Frederick Douglass's abolitionist newspaper, was a site of refuge. A lot of enslaved people were still trying to escape slavery, not just going north within the United States, but ultimately crossing the border and going into Canada. And the Liberator would actually publish success stories based on this. So they would make announcements that so-and-so had successfully made it to Canada via the Underground Railroad. So promoting this for others, and also as a way of letting people know that their loved ones might have reached safety. And of course, we did have readership. There were subscribers in Canada. The Liberator, again, reached a fairly wide audience despite its relatively modest subscription numbers. In terms of individual articles, I can't speak to that, but Garrison did regularly report on international events, which would have included things that were ongoing in Canada as they related to the anti-slavery cause.
Great. So I am wondering, what lessons do you think a contemporary audience can draw from the Liberator about communication around social justice issues?
I think one of the most important things to remember, and I mean, this was sort of part of the schism between Garrison and Frederick Douglass, is that we should be creating space for the voices of those who are directly impacted by these issues. This kind of paternalism where people in positions of privilege take on responsibility for righting these wrongs without involving the people who are directly affected is an ongoing challenge and something the Liberator struggled with. Garrison had a lot of support from the Black community. But as we can see, especially once he sort of had that rift with Frederick Douglass, that many still recognize that these ideas of racial uplift, there were still pervasive ideas that Black people were not able to raise themselves up, that they still needed the support of the white community. So I think really what we need to look at is the same issues we always do. Who's writing it? For why? Are these coming from people who have lived experience? and ultimately using our privilege to create spaces for those people to share their narratives instead of doing it just on their behalf.
Thank you. A few questions here about your connections to the research. The first is, what was the most unexpected thing you learned and have learned? I know that you have brought classes into our department to work with the Liberator as well.
First, I will say, yes, I've brought classes into the Liberator, and that has been one of the best teaching experiences I ever had. And I think my students would have agreed in their reflections. That was by far their favorite moment. And I do think what stood out to them and what stood out to me at the time was how far-reaching the coverage within the Liberator was. I think sometimes when we say that it's an abolitionist newspaper, we have this idea that all that was being reported in it was editorials and reports that were against slavery, that it was just this moralizing document. But this was still a newspaper. Garrison was covering international events, revolts that were happening overseas, often with an eye towards pieces that might be of interest to people who are involved in anti-slavery. But Garrison became, throughout his career, very critical of a number of institutions. So he got into scuffles with the church. He criticized government, the military. So some describe him as an anarchist. And it's quite interesting the number of areas in his career he sort of managed to branch out, starting with this abolitionist cause.
Interesting. And I think the last question that we will go with today is, what led you to this work and how did it shape you?
So my research in general in this area actually came from a second-year undergraduate history course here at McMaster that was taught by Dr. Karen Balcom. And it was about slavery and the way in particular that we write about issues of race and how these issues are covered by historians and by popular audiences, the way things are distorted. And as to why I went for my PhD research, going into racialized violence, I'm not sure, but I think what struck me was the uneven way that these events are reported. And again, the way that a lot of times it's not the people who directly experienced these atrocities that were being the ones to get to have the opportunity to talk about it, to share their experiences. And when you're studying marginalized people, you really do have to read against the grain. You're often reading sources that were either written by white people or where white people were mediators in the creation of those sources. So it creates a challenge. Not only do we have to look for their voices, but we're looking for both the voices of the white people who were involved, but the actual voice that's being purported to be telling this story. We have so many slave narratives that today are coming under fire from historians for what's actually true in them. Can we even use these as a source? Because we know that they were manipulated for an end.
Thank you. That's an excellent summary. Well, I think that brings us to the end of the question period today. I want to take another moment to thank Dr. Whitwell for this really wonderful talk. We so appreciate it. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. A few notes as we wrap up. Again, as you have heard today, the library's Archives and Research Collections Division does have many issues of the Liberator. And during regular times, not the pandemic, we are open to the public and definitely encourage people to come in and to make use of these resources. This talk was recorded today, and it will be available in about a week to view. The alumni office will send you a link. You will also see a survey pop up when the webinar ends, and the alumni team is very appreciative of your feedback, and we as organizers of the series are very appreciative of any suggestions that you might have. So please do fill it out. And that brings us to the end of the talk. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.